Hey everyone, it's your boy here, Mr. Jennings, and I went ahead and filmed the last part of the video, and I totally forgot to film a small section. So, we're going to do that real quick. We're having to reshoot a bunch of videos because of technical so things are a little out of order. Okay, so this little video here is just going to talk about ecosystem stability and how ecosystems are measured in their stability. The next video you're supposed to watch is how ecosystems respond to change, and that's really the important part. But we do need to talk about the stability, because I think the stability portion, even though ecology is not the AP exam, this could be something they talk about, because you don't necessarily have to know this content to do well on this content, but, and this is a big one, but you could still introduce this in material onto the AP exam to be able to respond to it. So if you have a little bit of an advantage there, I'm going to try to help you out. Also, I think this stuff's really interesting. We've already discussed a little bit of it in class. All right, so let's go ahead and zoom in. Here. Okay. So, ecosystem stability. Now, not all ecosystems are equal. Different ecosystems have different amounts of biodiversity. There is a direct relationship between the biodiversity of an ecosystem and the stability of that ecosystem. The biodiversity stability is based on its genetic diversity, its species diversity, and its biome diversity. Now, why do we care about ecosystem stability? Well, all ecosystems are interaction networks. The more components of an ecosystem, the more possible those interactions are less important. If you're hearing that, that is the trash truck. It's the joys of working from home, and I do apologize, but I'm trying to keep these earnest and kind of real so they feel like more like a real classroom. If it doesn't have bells in it, is it really a big orange biology video? Okay, so the more components there is for an ecosystem, the more possible interactions, but also less reliant on any of those interactions are to the total system. I could take out a component and the system works just fine. Now, decreasing biodiversity has a direct impact on the number of components in the system and increases the reliance on any of the remaining interactions. If any of those interactions are disrupted, the ecosystem could and possibly will collapse. So, the reason we have these pictures here, this is the human suburb developments that happened shortly after the 1950s. After the World War II and the Korean War, once Americans started coming home, they started having money and they went to college, and they were able to afford these subdivision houses. Really great. Thing is, these houses were often built on large pieces of farmland or grassland or even wetlands, especially in this area. Any of those three in this area, especially. As they were draining and filling in these wetlands, because this land was cheap, for instance, by the way, Disney World was built on a swamp because it was stupid cheap. But as they were draining these swamps and filling them in, they had an adverse impact on a certain group of organisms. Amphibians. Wetlands are reliant on amphibians are reliant on wetlands. They need water to live. So, as you can see here, this is the percentages of species that are critically endangered, or vulnerable. Almost 30% of all species of amphibians are at some sort of risk, with almost 8% critically endangered, meaning they're on the verge of extinction. Another about 10% of that is considered endangered, meaning they're at risk, but the risk could be mitigated, and vulnerable, which means they're at risk of becoming endangered. Now, these numbers are vary time to time. Now, human settlements are not the only reason for amphibians. Water pollution is another major factor, but you can also see something like mammals. Taking out these big grasslands has affected mammals and birds just as much. So impact is there. It's a very unknown thing. In the name of progress, though, we like to tout progress. We want these big economic advantages, but often at the cost of our ecosystem. And that's the thing here. You got to keep that in mind. There is a cost-reward system to all this. Now, keystone species are any species that have a large role in maintaining the ecosystem structure. We discussed this before this all went to hiatus when we talked about the impact of some species are more equal than others. Removal of a keystone species has a large impact on the ecosystem, both directly and indirectly, because those keystone species are critical movers. An example of this was the sea otter and the sea star. So the sea otter eats sea urchins. Now you're going to go, that's cool. But in ecosystems where the sea otters were removed, the sea urchins ran rampant. And they ate all of the kelp forest, basically decreasing the overall biodiversity by lowering the number of producers. When the sea otters were present, the sea urchins were still there. They kept, they were still there, but there were less of them, and the kelp forest was a lot more resilient and had more biodiversity because there's more organisms that can take advantage of the kelp. Because the sea urchin was just too good at its job. Also, sea urchins are resilient as heck. They can go without food for days and they become nutritionally poor, and there's a lot of factors. Conversely, sea stars. This was actually measured directly. When they took sea stars out of an ecosystem, these mussels and clams overtook tidal pools. They were able to outcrowd and compete all sorts of organisms because their primary predator was sea stars. They would go over these clams and eat them. By keeping them in check, they left more room for the ecosystem for other organisms to live and thus increase the biodiversity. So these organisms, while inconsequential at first and everything, they have a major impact on this ecosystem. This is the whole idea of the green world hypothesis, that it is not the primary consumer that keeps the plant in check. It's the secondary consumer that eats the primary consumer. The thing that keeps who watches the watching, who keeps the consumer in check, the predator. Now, ecosystems can also be facilitated. Some organisms are great at creating suitable environments. Beavers are probably the biggest example of this. They're nature's engineers, after all. But one thing to keep in mind is they can be destructive to human impact. So a lot of farmers, for instance, do not like beavers because they damage the water streams and stuff like that. Now, this is making everything suitable for ecosystems to, for everything to survive. There's not only just beavers. A lot of ground burrowing animals are really good innovators. They facilitate. They make the ecosystem more sustainable for other organisms to use their burrows. Some birds will make nests that other organisms can end up moving into. All sorts of facilitation can happen and does happen in the ecosystem. So humans aren't the only ones that can do this. Other animals do it as well. Now, one major role of an ecosystem stability is measured in how well its producers are. As producers, while they are not the main limiting factor, they have a role affecting the structure of the community. Basically, they keep things in check. If there's not enough food, there's not enough food. Now, limiting environmental factors can also contribute to an ecosystem structure and stability. For example, limited space on a coral reef. Coral reefs are really known for being biodiversity hotspots. When there's so many organisms there, their competition takes place, and that actually affects the ecosystem structure. And it could affect its stability if the competition is unbalanced. Now that is really where I want to stop here, because that's where the video picked up the last one. Alright, let's kind of bring it back up. Okay, so everything in an ecosystem is interconnected. What you do affects everything else. And that's not just for humans, by the way. Other animals have greater impact. We have keystone species. They are so critical to the ecosystem. If they were to disappear, they would struggle. The ecosystem would struggle. And we have seen that. We can look outside today. We see the deer populations rampant because we don't have apex predators for the deer. The deer are keeping the low undergrowth of the forest really under severe restrictions, and our forests are not as healthy. We have a lot more deer than necessary, so it's going to be deer starvation, all sorts of factors. The big thing to take away is ecosystems are stable based on how diverse they are. And the more diverse they are, the less reliant they are on individual components. But every time you take away a part of that component, the ecosystem becomes more stressed. Keep that in mind whenever you look at how ecosystems, you see real estate development, etc. This is now the final video. This is not actually going to be the final video. There's actually another part after this, but this is the last recording I've made. So take care. I will see you all possibly later this week. We're probably going to do some kind of Google Meet thing. I don't know. I'll talk more about it on campus. But you have a great day.